Okay, we're going to deal with doubt tonight. Before we do that, I'm going to say that some of the best comments that I get from folks in teaching class are after the class is over and they come up to me and said, well, I would have said this, but I didn't want to interrupt what was going on. And then I think, why didn't you say that? Because it's a great comment. So as we were going home last week, Levon said to me, when I asked the question, why bother with studying evidences or looking at objections? She said, well, I was going to say, it's all around us. And I thought, yeah, it would have been great to say, because you're exactly right. And no sooner had that taken place than I was looking at YouTube, and I think this is where this kind of phone operates, where your phone's listening to your conversation, and then you get these suggestions on YouTube. So I saw a little blurb there about Joe Rogan and, let me get his name right, Wesley, I think it's Fluff. I think it's Wesley Fluff. Anybody know? So this guy is pretty sharp. Anyway, it said something about resurrection of Christ. So I brought that up, and I wrote down what Joe Rogan said at one point, because I thought, that's exactly what we've been saying. So he's interviewing this Wesley, who is Canadian, I believe, and he's PhD linguist, deals with biblical languages, etc. Really sharp guy. And so Joe Rogan starts one of his questions by saying, what do you think about the resurrection? And he says, it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate population. In other words, those poor people back there 2,000 years ago didn't really know much. You're dealing with thousands of years of time, and that's right. We've said there's a large amount of time between then and now. You're dealing with an oral tradition that you have, and you have us sitting there talking about it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. So he's basically expressing to this apologist, how do you deal with that? What conclusions do you draw? And I just thought that was interesting, that, yeah, it really is all around us. And Ray has said multiple times that our young folks especially go on YouTube, you hear any and everything. And so it's good to be aware of this, and right down our alley, the very things we're talking about. And then I happened to hear Joe Rogan say, well, I heard about you, he was saying this to Wesley, when you did the debate with Billy, what's his name? Billy, so I thought, well, I'll look that up. I did. And here was this guy talking about religion, and he's not necessarily anti-God, but he's saying, well, the Bible has got a lot in common with a lot of other things, so it's really nothing special. So that was interesting. But this Wesley did a really good job of a lot of his answers. So anyway, that's just to throw in there to say, yeah, it is all around us, and that's one of the reasons we're studying. So having said all that, let's shift gears, and let's think about dealing with doubt. And I'm not able to advance the slide. Can you do that back there, Ian? Is it stuck? There we go. All right, so our last lesson next week, we'll have our singing. What I didn't put on the lesson sheet that I discovered today, I hadn't put it on there, was these examples of doubt. It's interesting that Jesus' own disciples doubted Jesus while with him during his ministry. So they might provide a little help to us as to what causes doubt. We've talked about belief and faith. The opposite of confidence and trust is to doubt something. And so even though you haven't had a chance to look at these, I think as we describe them, as you turn to them, we'll be familiar with them. Luke 8:22-25 is where Jesus is crossing the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, and he's asleep in the boat. Do you remember what happens? And you can look at the account if you want to. What's What's that? Yeah, a storm comes up. They start filling with water. It says they were in danger, and they cry out, Master, we are perishing. They wake him up. We are perishing. I don't know that I've ever been in a boat filling with water. I don't think I'd want to be. I don't know if I would feel like I'd know what to do in that situation. You know, try to swim, I guess, if you end up in the water. And so they're afraid, even though Jesus is with them. And so what does he do? He stills the storm. He calms the storm. And then he says to them, verse 25, where is your faith? And over in Mark's account, verse 40 of chapter 4, he asks them, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? So he seems to rebuke them because they shouldn't have been as concerned. So interesting, isn't it? Well, let's go to the next one. Should have shown you this one. All right, Matthew 14 is a little bit like this one. Do you remember this occasion? You're turning over there. What happens in Matthew 14? It also takes place on the water, but it's a little bit different. What happens here? Okay, Jesus sends them across, the disciples. He stays behind to pray. It's after the feeding of the 5,000, I believe. And what happens to them on the way? And oddly enough, they're going at night. Maybe they're accustomed to that. Okay. They're not making any progress in a storm. Have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to get somewhere? Maybe it's on a boat, maybe it's in a car, and you're not making much progress? I can remember driving down I-95. I'd gone up to Jacksonville to play golf with my son, and we were going to play 2 rounds, but we cut it short because this big storm was coming through. So I got in the car and tried to drive through that storm back home. And I didn't know whether to stop, because that seemed dangerous, or to keep going. That seemed dangerous. So I don't know if you've been in that kind of situation, but here they are. They're not making much progress. And what's the first thing that causes them concern? They see Jesus, but they think he's a ghost. Have you ever seen a ghost? Well, I don't know that any of us have, but have you ever heard a noise that you didn't know what it was? And maybe you're alone, or maybe you were with someone and you wonder, where did that come from? Well, it's that sort of thing. And so they're concerned. And in fact, it says when they saw him, they were terrified. They were terrified, thinking it was a ghost. They cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke and said, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Which seemed to have calmed them, so much so that what's Peter do? He says, Lord, if it's you, let me come and walk to you. Jesus says, go ahead and do it. And he seems to do fine until what? He sees the waves. Yeah. When he saw the wind, well, he didn't see the wind, but he saw what the wind was doing. It says he was afraid, verse 30, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And Jesus says to him in verse 31, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" That's a good question. Why did you doubt? All right, so again, let's look at the particulars here. So really a couple of instances where they're fearful, and then Peter himself is fearful, and Jesus saves him. He does indeed. Okay, Matthew 26. This one's a little different, 56 to 58. We could actually go to the end of the chapter. This setting is the Garden of Gethsemane. And what happens? I think it's... Okay. And so verse 56 says, all this has taken place, and that's what happened beforehand, which is in the details. And what did the disciples do when Jesus is taken? Left him and fled, verse 56. And yet, look at verse 58, Peter was following him at a distance. So here's Peter. He's still there, but he's not with Jesus. The others have fled. And what do we know happens in verses 69 to 75? What's Peter do 3 times? He denies Jesus. I don't know him. And protests, I don't know him. Now, why would he do that? Here we're not really given the reason so much. It just says they fled, and we know that he denies Jesus. What would you say? Fearful of what's going to happen? Okay, reprisal. I think there's something else that enters in that we'll see with these others. What's something else that might be going on? Because Peter has protested to the Lord, Lord, even if you have to die, I'll die with you. And seems very confident as long as what? Yeah, as long as Jesus is in control. Suddenly, Jesus isn't in control anymore. Does Peter understand that? I don't think so. What's going on here? Jesus has always been in control of the situation and taken command. He doesn't do that. So maybe he misunderstands and is confused about what's going on. All right, 2 more examples. Mark 16, 9 to 14 are 2 different examples. Mary Magdalene comes and tells the disciples that she has seen the Lord risen. We talked about the evidence of these witnesses. And how do the disciples, apostles react? Verse 13, they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Oh, sorry, I got to move back up closer. Yeah, verse 10, she went and told all those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. And then the second instance are possibly these 2 that were on the road to Emmaus in Luke's account. Maybe not, but it says he appeared to another he appeared in another form to 2 of them. Yeah, as they were walking into the country, seems to be the same. They went back and told the rest, but they did not believe him. Okay? And so what does he do when he finally appears to them in verse 14? Rebukes them for their unbelief and their hardness of heart because they had not believed. So what do you think is the difficulty here? Why did these people not believe Mary and then believe the other 2? Okay. A heart issue, hardness of heart. Okay, all right. Yeah, and unbelief involves the heart. Again, I would say, were they confused? Were they in a state of shock? Mourned and wept sounds like, they're taking this very seriously, aren't they? Yeah, Rick? Yeah. Right. Right. I don't know if sometimes if they didn't get into that level. Okay, and we talked a little bit, I guess, Sunday about the idea that they weren't understanding. It wasn't in their paradigm as far as what the kingdom was going to be. That Jesus is going to be crucified. That's the way this happens. Their idea was no doubt that Jesus was going to be victorious. And when that wasn't the case, they're confused. And then when they're mourning and they're told that, well, he's actually been raised from the dead, it seems like they have a hard time comprehending it. And we all know this last one, John chapter 20, we call him Doubting Thomas. And what's the sequence there? Okay, so he wasn't there when Jesus first appears to the other 10, and so when they say we've seen the Lord, he says, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails and place my finger into the mark of the nails and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. So, what do you think about Thomas? Poor doubting Thomas, is that who we're describing here? He is. Okay. What's he asking for? Evidence that he had not yet seen. All right, so to his credit, where is he 8 days later? He's not off somewhere else having made a decision about this. He's with the other disciples. Jesus appears again, offers proof to him, and how does Thomas react? He doesn't even have to examine or investigate. He sees Jesus and he says, my Lord and my God. Okay, so different reasons for doubt. Maybe we can add to those. Let's just kind of put those all together here. And one of the questions I ask is, are these similar reasons for us and others as to, well, let me just ask first, do we ever doubt? Do we have some doubts? Which we're not talking about, oh, I'm giving up on all this. But maybe questions about why did this happen, or what's this passage mean, or something like that. And I think we all are shaking our heads, yes, we understand that there is that element that arises from time to time. Now, let me just use I'll do something else before. Yeah, go ahead, Rick. Yeah, yeah. Okay. A lot of times we don't understand what's happening. We are somewhat confused. Or sometimes we're fearful. I talked about that storm I was driving through. Maybe you've been in a situation like that. And there is some doubt about, is everything going to be okay? That doesn't necessarily make you lose faith in God or in his son Jesus Christ, but there might be some doubt that arises. I've used this before, but let me ask the question again. When we think about doubt, and that didn't show up very well, that's my fault, the right-hand side is supposed to say emotional versus rational. So when you think about doubt, you think about someone having doubts. I might think of a college student, and he's gone away from home for the first time, and he's been a faithful Christian, and he goes off to college, and he takes a couple of courses that the professor is just kind of tearing into somebody that believes in the Bible. And so here's this poor college student sitting in his room, and maybe he's a little bit fearful of that. But we tend to think of that situation like someone who's looking for evidence, thinking through, reasoning. Okay? But what would you say? Where does Satan like to strike us? Okay. More the emotion, which, the insecurities, the physical senses are affected. And I think it happens to us just like it happens to the disciples. Now I'll give my example. When we were over in England, I think it was on a Wednesday night. I don't even remember why I was trying to figure this out, but I was trying to get on to the live stream. And so I tried to log in, and there was no live stream, and it was past 7 o'clock. And so I texted Meredith, and I said, everything okay? And nothing happened. And nothing happened for about 10 minutes. And I think I might have texted Rick. Now, rationally thinking, you might say, well, okay, something's not right. But emotionally, what happens? You start thinking, yeah, something must have gone wrong somewhere. And you just start imagining all sorts of things and jumping to all sorts of conclusions. Why isn't that live stream on? It should be on. And of course, what we found out later was, why wasn't it on? Because we had some kind of electrical mess up back here. But it's easy to be affected in that way and jump to all sorts of conclusions when you don't know what's happening. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
It's caused me to think about this. Oftentimes when a close loved one dies, maybe it's a spouse, parent, or you've been through surgery, one of the things that you are advised is no rash decisions.
Okay.
Because the emotions get in the way and your mind is not clear.
Okay. Decision making is more difficult. Clarity of mind is not always there. It might be that, I can imagine that if there's some kind of prescription involved, that could affect sound logic and thinking. Okay? All right, so, I'm not going to make a case one against the other. I think they're both involved. But I used this before. Here's this electrical, whatever they call it. I don't know, is this a substation or something? And they put a sign up that says, danger of death. Why do they have to do that? Yeah. They want us to stay away. It doesn't necessarily look dangerous, especially to a child. It just looks like a bunch of objects that are there. But there's a lot of danger attached to it. It doesn't look dangerous, but it is. On the other hand, you go up on a roller coaster, and I said, does this look dangerous? Sure, it does. Is it dangerous? Well, you'd probably say 99.9% chance that nothing's going to happen. You're taking some risk, yes. But what's the difference between the two? It's the emotional response to what it is. And I think that's what we've seen in these examples. You've got this fear element, this confusion element, this don't understand, and that enters into things. All right, having said that, one of the things that was in the lesson was, would you say this is more or less, and let me just go through these. Does someone have more doubt or less doubt when they're spending time, well, I'm not asking this right. Are they spending more time investigating evidence and that causes doubt, or usually it's less time investigating evidence that leads to doubt? Which would you say? Not enough, okay? Not really delving into it to find the answers. What about someone who's not making much of an effort to live a moral life? Are they more likely to have doubts, do you think, or less likely? Yeah. I can think of instances where someone has expressed doubt and they're not really living like they should. What about being surrounded by worldly people and influences? Are you more likely to start doubting or less likely to start doubting? Okay, I think you get the idea. Facing temptation and then concerned what people think about us. When does someone start expressing doubt? It's usually when there is less of an effort being made to really be what God wants us to be. So that should at least help us in terms of thinking of how we can react to this. So let's go back to what produces belief and faith. Here are three passages that were suggested to you. We all know Romans 10:17. Where does faith come from? Comes from hearing, and it depends on what we hear. And here it's the word of Christ. So we're listening to that which provides evidence for us, which comes from testimony. And that's what produces faith. All right, 1 Corinthians 15 is this example where Paul talks about all the different ones that had seen Jesus, and then he goes on to say, well, if Christ is not raised, what does that do to faith? Kind of nullifies it, doesn't it? Okay? So if Christ is not raised, one of the things he says is our faith is futile. There's no basis for our faith. Okay? But what about the basis for faith? Well, if there is evidence that Christ has been raised from the dead, then faith is not futile. That's the basis for evidence. The evidence is the basis for faith. And so that counteracts this idea that, faith is meaningless. Faith is not worthwhile. All right, the last one, John 20, 30, 31. What does John say about faith? I've written these things so that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that's based upon the signs that have been written in this book. Okay. So question. When there are difficulties that arise, when confusion arises, when we're frightened by something, has the evidence changed? No. John's gospel is still saying that Jesus did all these different things. But what's being attacked? We are being attacked, and our tie to that evidence that produces faith is being attacked, and that can result in us doubting. Okay? Comments or thoughts? Yeah, David?
I was going to mention, sometimes it's not just that the evidence has changed, but the perception
Yeah, okay.
of evidence. And I do think when people go through serious doubts, that sometimes it end up resulting in a rejection of previous faith. It is because their perceived evidence has changed. And, I do think we as Christians it's important if we want to see, the future Christians, our children and future generations, if we expect or want them to have strong faith, we're going to have to make sure that they're exposed to things so that they're not surprised. Because I do think what happens a lot of times, people have an idea of what they expect the evidence to be, and when they're put in a position that is different than what they're used to,
Yes.
they can go through a shock. And obviously, you mentioned mostly it is emotional. I didn't realize this many people thought this belief or faith I have is
Right.
stupid. This professor, he's logical. They might not be thinking right, but the perception is this objection comes from logic and reason. And he's made it very clear that anyone who thinks this way is stupid. Or, and when you have not prepared your young people for that exposure, you are setting them up for inevitable failure.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very important. And if you look at what's happened over the last couple of decades, I think back to, people or a lot of Christians that were my age when I was 20. I see a lot of them have changed their beliefs for a variety of reasons. And a big part of it is this. Their perception of the evidence, they think that it has changed.
Okay. And that's a worthwhile point. And I don't want to diminish for a moment the fact that, here might be, suppose, new evidence or something I hadn't heard of. And that can certainly cause us to rethink something. Megan, what were you going to say? Yes.
And so in some ways, if you see your faith as something that you're constantly working on, then when things make you doubt or things come to you that you've never thought about, you don't just all of a sudden stop believing. You just see it as another step in growing your faith. Or if you're not taking that step to grow, then you diminish it. But essentially, it's a
Okay, very good. And that was one of the passages on there. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. There really is a sort of a spectrum. There is a point at which, and we've talked about it, you believe, and so you act on that belief. But even at that point, can that be strengthened? Can that be weakened? Of course it can. I mean, that's the nature of faith. I really believe, maybe I've got a lot of good reasons to believe, but at another time I might be weaker for whatever reason, or someone presents a really good argument, and I need to consider that, Derek. Yeah, yeah, that certainly enters into it. Okay, with these thoughts in mind, we've got about 10 minutes here. Let's think about, so I said, do they change? No, they don't change. Okay, and I've got this one, sorry. The nature of faith, among other things, assurance of things hoped for, conviction of things not seen. We walk by faith and not by sight. And so the question sheet said, does our faith mean that we're going to answer every difficult question, have a reason for every disappointment, have a purpose for every problem, outcome of every action we know? Yeah, that would be a nice world to live in, but we don't live in that world. And really walking by faith means that despite challenges, we're still going to hold to what we trust in. Okay, so having said that, let's go to the next one. What can we do? So I've suggested some passages. You might have some others, and that's fine. Let's just try to go through these, and then we'll try to apply this here at the end. So James 1 tells us what about doubt or about faith that may help us in this. What are we supposed to do? Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Okay? So first of all, there are going to be trials. Why should I be joyful in the midst of trials? Okay. It's going to produce something good, James says. It's going to produce steadfastness. It's going to produce patience. And he says that will have its work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So I don't rejoice because the challenge comes. I rejoice in knowing that if I face that challenge and if God helps me overcome that challenge, I can be more complete than I would otherwise be. Is that true? Does adversity that's overcome make us stronger? I think it does. It can tear away at us. It can get the best of us, but we can also overcome and be stronger as a result. It's interesting, in the second part of that verse, he says, if you lack wisdom, ask God, but you better ask in faith. Well, how does that help us when doubt's the problem? How do you ask in faith when you're facing doubt? Okay.
So you don't go to, for instance, a secular book to read something about spiritual.
Okay. Yeah, you go to a source that you know is going to be helpful, one in which you trust, God's Word, for instance. Okay? And it is an act of faith. And sometimes you have to act on the basis of faith, and God promises that there will be benefit to that. All right, a couple here, number 2, James 5, 7 to 11, Hebrews 12 and 2. James goes on to say, verse 7 of chapter 5, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it. And then he says, you also be patient, establish your heart. So what's the point? Yeah. That's what the farmer has to do. He has to wait for the rain to come. And he sows his crop. Maybe the rain hasn't come, but he sows it in hope that the rain will come and bless him. And then he mentions at the end of that section, as an example of suffering and patience, if you need it, he gives us a couple of examples. You remember what they are? Okay, the steadfastness of Job is the second one, and then he says the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord is the first one. So look at them. And Hebrews 12 verse 2 says, who are we to look to as an example of someone who is steadfast regardless of what he's confronted with? Looking to Jesus, yeah, the author and finisher of our faith.
Sometimes we set a arbitrary limit to how long we're going to do something.
Okay,
And it would be like, in the example here, of a farmer, tilling up everything that he had planted.
right,
Because he said, if it doesn't rain by July 6th, I'm going to,
yeah,
I'm going to
plow it under,
plow it under.
right, okay,
Sometimes we do that to ourselves, and kind of set ourselves up for failure, and by arbitrarily, setting walls, goals, et cetera, that,
right,
we need to, sometimes leave in God's hands.
okay. And part of what he says here is, you've seen the purpose of the Lord. This is in reference to Job, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So we have trust that God is acting in our best interest, even though it doesn't seem as though we're getting the results that we want. Philippians 4 and 6, we probably all know this one. In everything, don't be anxious, but in everything with prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God. And what's God going to do? He's going to give us the peace that passes understanding. So what's that mean? I mean, I'm going to understand everything? No. But I can have peace even though I don't understand everything, because I can put it in his hands. 1 Thessalonians 5:11. Pretty simple passage there. Paul tells the Thessalonians to do what? Encourage one another and build one another up. So we have each other responsibility, don't we? We're helping, we're looking out for, we're trying to encourage. Hebrews 10, 22 to 24. What do we do in addition to that? It's kind of like the previous one. He says, verse 23, hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Don't waver, for he who promised is faithful. Remember that God is faithful to his promises. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. What's the love and good works got to do with it? If I stir you up to love others and to do good, how is that helping you with doubt? Pardon me, say that again. Okay. What happens when you believe something and you act on that belief and there's an outcome? What generally happens in those cases? You feel better? You feel like you've accomplished something, you've been productive, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Sometimes we get discouraged from having made an effort, but I think that's the point there. All right, last one, 2 Peter 1, 12 to 18. Peter says repeatedly in this passage, I want to do what before I die? Starts with an R. I want to remind you. I'm writing this down so that I can remind you, and after my decease, you'll be reminded of what I'm writing. I said the other day, Samuel Johnson, I heard the quote, we need reminding more than we need instructing. I don't know if that's the case, but reminding is important, isn't it? And he also says at the end of that passage, what we told you was not cleverly devised what? The things we said about seeing Jesus on the Mount, they're not fables, they're not myth. We saw them. We heard God say to him, you're my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So we're going to end with this. There's all those reasons together. So the question was, you have a friend that's losing his or her faith. What do you say? What do you do? Real quick. We got about a minute. All right, listen. Yeah. Ask some questions. Why do you feel this way? What are you going through? Could that help us as As somebody who's listening, sure. Okay, anything else we can do?
Encourage them, or you can give them some ways that
All right.
it is that's overcoming them.
Okay, encourage them, give them some things to do. Okay. Remind them we can find peace. What else can we remind them of? If we listen to them and find out what it is they're questioning. Big picture here. What can we remind them of? Yeah, and God's evidence. Let's look to that evidence. Let's see what the problem is. Let's try to find some answers and then try to deal with that and help them deal with that. Okay. Thanks for your participation here. We'll close with that. Next Wednesday, we'll have a singing, and we'll try to really emphasize some of the things we've been talking about in terms of creation, God's Word, Jesus as God's Son.